Right now, I am sat in my gym. For any of you who don't know, I own this space and I also run an online coaching platform. And for anyone who has followed my journey over the last few years, I started out as the kettlebell coach. I become the quickest person to achieve both SFG1 and SFG2, which are the two highest kettlebell qualifications that you can attain in the world. I managed to get both of them done within a month. And not to sound like I'm blowing smoke up my own arse, but I was probably well regarded as one of the most proficient coaches in the city, if not the country, and certainly one of the strongest in terms of body weight ratios. Managed to press a 48 kilo kettlebell at 69 kg, and I've done all kinds of crazy shit with them, which you will see on my Instagram. But this video is an honest breakdown of what kettlebell training actually is, and why I don't really think it's the best option for anyone who is looking to build muscle. You see, kettlebell training has absolutely exploded over the last few years, and probably for good reason, right? It's really fun, and a lot of people had gotten pretty bored with bodybuilding. That's why we've seen the rise of things like CrossFit and High Rocks, because it's a lot more engaging, and you'll see a lot of kettlebell classes, particularly in Liverpool, being run all over the city. And I think it's really great that we can all come together and be part of a shared space and a shared community where everyone kind of has the same interest. And I think that's a really huge benefit of kettlebell training in of itself, is that it's a really small implement and you can get a group of people together in a really small space like this, which is what I used to do. I used to run kettlebell classes, and the energy was really infectious, and it's really fun. And kettlebells are a great tool for conditioning. They're a great tool for fun and for engagement, and I think they're a really great tool for strength as well. With that being said, I think they're a pretty poor option for hypertrophy and building muscle. I'm going to explain exactly why that is. The first reason is this: kettlebells are an awkward implement, right? And that's what makes them so difficult to master. Most people are really poor at using kettlebells when they first start, because we've got things to consider like the dynamics of the bell, the placement of your arm inside the kettlebell window, the handle positioning, obviously the size of the bell with cast iron bells changes how the lift is executed for a lot of people, and that's what helps you get really strong in really awkward positions. And you will see people who are training in BJJ and wrestling and things like that using them, because the body is in lots of awkward positions. Naturally, you want to train with an implement that's a little bit harder to control. But it's for that same reason that I think they're a really poor tool for developing stimulus across the full body. Now, I will just preface this by saying there are certain movements where I think you can build a lot of size using kettlebells. Something like a split squat, something like a strict overhead press. I think they're both really great, and the kettlebell lends itself to them movements. And I think it's going to be a very long time before you progress to a weight where the kettlebell becomes unmanageable in terms of the dynamics of that actual movement itself. But kettlebell training is pretty much centered around ballistic movement. So for those of you who don't know, kettlebell training is split into two categories. We've got things that we call grinds, which are things like presses, squats, anything that is a lot slower. And then we've got things called ballistics, which are pretty much swings, cleans, snatches, all that sort of stuff, where we are training more for power and explosivity, as opposed to like kind of getting time under tension or anything like that. The problem with these ballistic movements is they're really good for conditioning, but they're not great for hypertrophy because they don't meet the main criteria for building muscle, which is failure, right? You can't really go to failure on a set of swings. The thing that gives out more than anything is going to be your grip, or you're going to be limited by your cardiovascular output. And I would know this. I've completed the snatch test where you've got to do 100 snatches in 5 minutes for the Strong First certification. And it certainly wasn't strength that was given out. It was my ability to actually catch up to what I was doing using the breath that was really difficult. Now, for me, if I am looking to build muscle, and that is the main objective, I am going to optimize for the method that allows me to output the most effort in the most stable and predictable way possible. If we look at kettlebells, it's really difficult to train our legs proficiently with them, because naturally there's very few options. We've got things like a goblet squat. I have a 60 kilo kettlebell over there, right? I can get that up and I can squat that, I think 17 times is my PB, right? The challenge becomes the core, the grip, and the forearms, not the legs. If I put 60 kilo on a barbell, which I've done before, I know I can squat that 30, I think 32 times was the maximum amount of times I could squat that on a slant board. So naturally my legs are getting double the stimulus just because I've chosen to use a different implement that lends itself a little bit more to hypertrophy. If we then look at the overhead press, for example, I got to a point where, because of my frame and because I've got naturally quite small wrists, when I was pressing a 48 kilo kettlebell, I could do it, but it was a lot more challenging for me to do, and I could only press it one time, compared to something like a seated dumbbell shoulder press, where I can press 240s overhead 6 or 7 times. Which of these do you think is going to give you the better stimulus? Not only that, but when you are pressing something that's as big and awkward as a kettlebell on one side, it can become very taxing on the lower back. And that's not to say that kettlebell training does your lower back, and I hate people who say that it doesn't. It made my lower back really, really strong. But what you will find is when you are contorting yourself around the kettlebell and trying to get it up and putting that hip shift into it, it's naturally going to feel a little bit strained. It also doesn't feel that comfortable on the shoulders. We're also limited with kettlebell training. If we do a double overhead press to try and mitigate that factor, we're limited as to how much we can actually clean up, right? So for me, I know I can press the double 40s for like 1 to 2 reps, and I use a lot of energy in the clean, actually getting that up into the rack position before I can actually press it. That's a huge thing. If you can't get the weight up there in the first place, there is no double overhead press for you, and therefore you are completely unable to train your shoulders effectively with kettlebells. I do think they're a really good tool, and you can build muscle with any tool. I probably built a tiny little bit of muscle using kettlebells, but if you've seen any of my videos before, you'll have seen how really ridiculously strong I was with them, and my physique just did not match up to that, right? The other problem becomes accessory movements. Nothing pisses me off more than seeing someone curling a kettlebell, right? Even when they're in a gym where they have access to dumbbells, because they are so shoehorned into this ideology that kettlebell training is the best, and they try and convince themselves that, it's actually fine if I do a curl with the kettlebell, because I can feel it and I'm getting the pump and whatnot. The reality is you're not going to be able to curl any meaningful weight. You're going to be massively limited by your grip and also the size and shape of the kettlebell. Just fucking use a set of dumbbells. Like, the way I see training is that all tools are just used to implement principles, and therefore we should select the correct tool for that job and not try and put a square peg into a round hole. Believe me, I spent years of my life kettlebell training. I spent years of my life entrenched in circles and following people on Instagram who loved kettlebells, and I loved them, and I loved the community that, we managed to kind of all build up together. I had loads of the top kettlebell influencers in the world on my podcast. I was speaking to them all the time. I was getting a lot of recognition. I was getting a lot of engagement because it's novel. Not very many people were doing it to the extent that I was doing it at the time. It was fun, and it made for really, really good content. But now what we're starting to see is people who have spent 10 to 15 years bodybuilding coming into the kettlebell space and then essentially using their physique as a marketing tool to say, look at these methods that I am implementing with kettlebells. You can also get into this shape if you decide to start following my program or signing up for my kettlebell course or whatever it might be. What a lot of these people fail to tell everyone is that they have spent years and years bodybuilding, and that it only takes a fraction of the volume that it took to build the muscle to actually maintain it. So I know I could stop bodybuilding and start kettlebell training and maintain my physique. I could then tell everyone that I built my physique using kettlebells, when the reality was that as soon as I stopped them, that's when I started seeing the biggest changes in my musculature and in my strength as well. And now when I go back to kettlebells, which will be once in a blue moon, I can lift way more than I could just when I was training bells. And that's because bodybuilding is the best way to develop strength and to build a physique. That is not really up for debate. Like, you look at bodybuilders, people say, oh, that's not really functional muscle, it doesn't matter. Believe me, it will be a lot easier for a bodybuilder to step into the kettlebell space and perform an amazing strength feat than it would be for any kettlebell lifter to get under a barbell and do the exact same thing. That's not to say there's no transfer of strength. There is. I went from kettlebell training and went kind of straight into deadlifting 200 kilo. So naturally, there was a lot of strength carryover because of all the hinge work that I was doing with kettlebells. I'm not saying you can't get strong with them. I'm just saying when people online try and put out that, you know, kettlebells are the only way to get strong in awkward positions, or kettlebells are the way to get strong, it's just simply not the case. There's more than one way to skin a cat. And I would just be very, very hesitant before starting out on a journey with kettlebells and really think about what your goals are. If your goals are to be more explosive and to be better at flows and, you know, be more athletic, I certainly think kettlebells are a fucking excellent option for doing that. They helped my athleticism to no end. They helped my aerobic capacity to no end. What they didn't do for me was build the muscles that really mattered, help me fill out my t-shirt, all that side of things. I just don't think they're a very, very good tool for that. And you can take my word for it, because I've not only coached hundreds of clients through kettlebell training and those same clients in bodybuilding, but I've also done it myself. And I know that the results that people get from much, much less volume in a gym intentionally using barbells, cables, machines and dumbbells way outstrip what they gotten with kettlebells before in the past. And that's the reason I stopped running my kettlebell classes a couple of months ago. It just become something that I no longer really believed in. I love the power of the community. I love the fact that everyone was getting together. I love that it created a nice environment and space for people to train. Would I tell anyone to not train with kettlebells? No. But what I would say is, if your priority is to look better, outside of the fat loss effect that you're probably getting as a result of making better choices and starting your kettlebell journey, you're not going to see any meaningful difference in your muscle mass unless you are a complete beginner. So yeah, that's my summary on kettlebells. I know it's probably going to piss a lot of the kettlebell community off. I know a lot of them unfollowed me on Instagram when I started talking about the fact that, you know, they weren't actually the panacea of strength and fitness, and that there's actually better ways to do certain things. But that's just my truth. That's my experience. Feel free to disagree with it, but I feel like I'm more than qualified to talk about the whole thing, considering I've spent many, many years doing both, and the same thing with my clients as well. So take that however you want it, but just make sure that you're cautious and you have a clear understanding of what your goals are and which methods you're using to actually achieve them goals as well.